In our headlines on this Tuesday afternoon, May 23rd, here in South Korea. Preparations are well underway for Korea's third space launch, which is scheduled to take place tomorrow, that is Wednesday evening, with the mission of carrying 8 actual payloads into orbit. And President Yoon Suk-yeol says the priorities within Seoul's broader foreign policy are deterring threats posed by Pyongyang and fostering economic security amid a climate of geopolitical uncertainty. Meanwhile, Seoul's team of inspectors is conducting an on-site survey in Fukushima amid Pyongyang's planned discharge of radioactive wastewater starting this summer that is raising much regional concern. Korea's Nuri space rocket is counting down precisely 1 day to its third launch into orbit, and this time with an actual mission. Now, that being said, my colleague Lee Kyung-eun is currently at the site of Wednesday's event and files this report.
At 6:24 p.m. May 24th, Nuri is set to blast off into space once again, this time on his first operational mission with his first real payload on board. And the final preparations are now underway at Naro Space Center in Goheung, the country's southern tip. At 7:20 a.m., it was rolled down from the assembly center. That's where since early this month, the third stage of the Nuri rocket was loaded with 8 satellites. This was then coupled to the first and second stage segments, completing the assembly of the 3-stage rocket. Nuri was then transported to the launch site via a specially designed non-vibrating transporter. The 1.5-kilometer distance took more than an hour, moving slower than walking speed to minimize any vibrations affecting the rocket. It was then erected and will later be connected with the umbilical tower, which will be injecting fuel and oxygen into the rocket right before blast off. But Nuri still needs final checkups on the weather and other aspects of the operation before the Korea Aerospace Research Institute decides on go or no go. That announcement will be made by 2 p.m. on the launch date. If everything goes as planned, Nuri will go into the last 10 minutes of automated pre-launch operation. This is when Nuri will be out of human hands and will start counting down on its own. If there's any change of time of more than 30 minutes from the 6:24 planned liftoff time, the launch will be postponed to a new date between the 25th and the 31st at the same time. The success of this launch depends on whether Nuri completes its mission, putting the 8 satellites into orbit. The whole process is expected to take 923 seconds. The official confirmation of success will be made at around 8 p.m. Yoon, Arirang News, Goheung.
Now, as we wait in anticipation for Nuri's third blast-off scheduled for tomorrow, our Kim Jong-sil takes a look back at Korea's 30-year journey to building its first own, that is, space launch vehicle. Do take a look.
It all began in 1993 when South Korea's first science rocket was launched. Founding member and former president of the Korea Aerospace Research Institute looks back on that moment 30 years ago.
I think it was a very important launch because it was the first step for the Korea Aerospace Research Institute to develop a rocket that would be used in space research. We had a mere 20 members on the team, and when it was put together and launched successfully, we were all thrilled and excited. I can still feel that moment like it was yesterday.
And 9 years later, the first liquid propulsion rocket was launched. As the rockets got bigger, the need to make the engine liquid was vital as it allows delicate control of the thrust, and another important reason.
The solid rocket can be easily transferred to the military purpose. So obviously, this may cause some international conflict of interest. So in order to avoid that kind of international situation, Korea decided to develop liquid rocket engine.
In 2013, South Korea's first satellite launch vehicle, Naro, went up into space. It was jointly developed by South Korea and Russia.
When we were developing the KSR-3, North Korea tried to launch a satellite using its Taepodong-1 technology. It failed, of course, but back then, the South Korean government also wanted to launch a satellite as soon as possible. So we needed the help of other countries. Russia, in this case, provided us the first stage rocket, while South Korea developed the second stage rocket.
The successful launch of Naro paved the way for Nuri, a space launch vehicle that's 100% South Korean technology. Not only is the rocket made in Korea, but the satellites are Korean as well.
And the Nuri now carries 8 satellites for practical application, such as ground observation or constellation mission and so on. So the third launch will be the first real-world application for the Nuri.
Fewer than 10 countries in the world have this technology, and South Korea hopes that Nuri's journey will be a stepping stone for South Korea to secure a global leading edge in space exploration. Kim Jung-sil, Arirang News.
Up next, our Isujin touches upon the potential commercial gains of the growing space industry as Korea seeks a firm foothold in the global market.
South Korea's aerospace sector may soon emerge as a new money-making business. The third launch of the Nuri rocket on May 24th includes participation from the private sector, including from Hanwha Aerospace. The private company was selected to receive a so-called technology transfer as part of the government's efforts to bolster the domestic aerospace industry. Hanwha will now receive a technology boost from the government, which is expected to spur further participation from the private sector, ushering in a new and more lucrative aerospace industry in South Korea. The global aerospace industry is expected to continue expanding with a predicted value of $1 trillion in 2040. An increase in investment in domestic aerospace companies will boost R&D, leading to a plethora of economic benefits.
The aerospace industry encompasses all industries related to space exploration, such as the construction and operation of launch vehicles and satellites, as well as the development and supply of satellite services, therefore having significant added economic value.
There are already domestic startups in the aerospace industry that have begun to develop their own space technology. Domestic rocket startup InnoSpace became the first private company in the country to successfully launch a rocket. Video footage shows InnoSpace's own suborbital rocket lifting off from Brazil on March 19. The increase in homegrown space technology will help reduce astronomical costs and barriers to entry into the space industry. On the day of the launch, stock prices of companies in related industries such as Korea Aerospace Industries closed up 2.46%, despite the nation's main Kospi bourse ending down 0.69%. Investment options in the private aerospace sector are also becoming diversified. Hanwha Asset Management offers the only ETF in the nation that invests in domestic space companies.
Nuri rocket's third launch is expected to lead to the participation of more private companies in the space industry, with more developing their own satellites, marking the beginning of a domestic space industry led by private companies.
As more private companies partake in aerospace R&D, space services and technologies may become commercialized, creating more added value for the economy as a whole. Isujin, Arirang News.
The priorities within Seoul's foreign policy are deterring threats posed by Pyongyang and fostering economic security. Remarks to this end were shared by President Yoon Suk-yeol at a cabinet meeting earlier on this Tuesday morning, following a flurry of diplomatic engagements that began last week. President Yoon partook in 11 sessions of bilateral summits, including those with the leaders of the G7 as well as Ukraine. Talks included condemnation of North Korea's hostile ambitions and intentions to upgrade trilateral efforts among Seoul, Tokyo and Washington regarding Pyongyang and broader regional security. President also underscored market diversification for South Korea while promising active and responsible diplomacy to tackle global challenges such as climate change and public health. And back on Monday, President Yoon Suk-yeol and his European Union counterparts Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel agreed to advance joint ventures in key sectors, including that of green technology. Our top office correspondent Kim Do-yeon reports.
President Yoon Suk-yeol hosted European Council President Charles Michel and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen for a summit in what was his final event of this Super Week of Diplomacy on Monday. And among his top priorities for improving bilateral relations, he saw the need to expand cooperation in 3 specific fields.
첫째, 우리는 그린, 보건, 디지털 분야 3대 파트너십을 강화해 나가기로 했습니다. 한 EU 그린 파트너십 체결을 통해 포괄적 기후 환경 분야 협력을 확대하기로 하였으며 한 EU 보건 비상 대비 대응에 대한 행정 약정 체결을 통해 글로벌 보건 위기 대응을 위한 공조 체제를 확립했습니다.
Our new green partnership will boost cooperation in areas like renewables and green technology. Importantly, through this partnership, we will strengthen our cooperation on the safe operation of nuclear power, among other issues.
This is the first time in 11 years for both European Council and Commission presidents to visit Seoul for a bilateral meeting. And this comes as the two sides celebrate the 60th anniversary of their diplomatic ties, which have been a strategic partnership since 2010. According to the joint statement released following the summit, an agreement was made on opening talks for South Korea to take part in the Horizon Europe Research and Innovation Program. This is an EU member program for advancing science and technology with a budget of more than $100 billion until 2027. Also discussed was security, specifically Russia's invasion of Ukraine and North Korea's missile and nuclear provocations, issues that South Korea and the EU have to deal with due to their proximity to those threats. Both sides reiterated the need for cooperation with a strategic dialogue at foreign ministerial level established to enhance cooperation on global peace and security. In the meantime, the Council President acknowledged South Korea's role in global affairs so far.
In a world profoundly shaken by Russia's war on aggression in Ukraine, Russia's blatant violation of the UN Charter and the international law, you condemned this war of aggression from the start. It is all to your credit, and it shows once again the strength of our bond.
The summit was followed by dinner where the European leaders were treated to Korean-style beef ribs. There, the 60th year of bilateral diplomacy was celebrated while toasting solidarity in freedom, peace, and prosperity. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Also, this past Monday here in Seoul, the Foreign Ministry hosted a director-level meeting with a visiting Chinese delegation, which marks the first face-to-face diplomatic exchange since last January. Choi Young-jun, the director of the ministry's Northeast Asia Bureau, sat down with his Chinese counterpart Yu Jin-shung. Choi stressed the need for the pursuit of a mature relationship based on mutual trust, mutual respect that is, while Ryu for his part is reported to have conveyed China's firm stance on matters of its national interest. Now, pundits believe the matters in question are related to remarks by President Yoon Suk-yeol regarding Taiwan during an interview with Reuters last month, during which he claimed tensions around Taiwan were due to attempts to change the status quo by force, which he opposed. In neighboring Japan, Korean officials are in Fukushima today for an on-site inspection, survey that would be, of Japan's efforts ahead of its planned discharge of radioactive wastewater from its crippled nuclear power plant located in the region. Our Shin Ha-young has more.
A team of 21 South Korean experts arrived at the Fukushima nuclear power plant on Tuesday for inspections at the site. This comes amid lingering concerns about the safety of the wastewater from the crippled plant ahead of its planned release into the sea. The inspection team will be at the site for 2 days, with day 1 focusing on examining the so-called ALPS purification system that removes radioactive substances from the contaminated water before it's released into the ocean. The so-called K4 storage tanks are also on the list for inspection. These tanks store and measure the concentration of radioactive substances in the contaminated water. The team will reportedly speak to the press on Tuesday at around 7 p.m. local time, where they'll provide some details of the inspection. On Wednesday, the team will visit a chemistry research lab at the plant to assess the facilities and the processes used to determine the amount of radionuclides in the wastewater. Ahead of the inspection, the team held a meeting on Monday with officials from the Tokyo Electric Power Company, which runs the Fukushima power plant, and officials from Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, as well as members of the Nuclear Regulation Authority. During the meeting, the South Korean team reaffirmed the list of facilities requiring inspection. It also requested inspection records of each facility and data on the contaminated water before and after filtration through the ALPS system. After completing the 2-day on-site inspection in Fukushima, the team is scheduled to hold a more in-depth meeting with Japanese officials in Tokyo on the last day, May 25th, ahead of their return. Meanwhile, at a press conference in Tokyo on Tuesday, Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Hirokatsu Matsuno said Japan will make efforts to increase South Korea's understanding of the safety of the wastewater through this inspection. 신하영, Arirang News.
In other news, an operation against reported terrorism has been put into motion in a border city in Russia amid an anti-Putin campaign by a group of Russian nationals. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
A group of anti-Putin Russian nationals has claimed responsibility for an attack in Russia's southwestern city of Belgorod, prompting the region's governor to launch an anti-terrorist operation to hunt down those responsible for the attack.
The current situation is that 8 people were injured. According to information from the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Defense, there were no civilian casualties. Once again, the situation is tense and remains so. A counter-terrorist operation was declared. Many restrictions are in place.
The Russian governor added that a large part of the local population had evacuated the area. Moscow has placed the blame on Ukraine, claiming that the group of Russian nationals has aligned itself with the Ukrainian army. However, while Ukraine does acknowledge that Russian citizens in 2 separate paramilitary groups had carried out an operation in the area, it acted independently and without any orders from Kyiv. The groups, who call themselves the Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps, said in a Telegram post that they had liberated a settlement in the Belgorod region. Russian authorities are still searching for those responsible for the attack, which led to 8 people being injured after a village was shelled. Fighting also damaged 3 houses and a local administrative building. According to CNN, the event in Belgorod marks the first time that Ukrainian aligned forces have launched a cross-border land operation against Russian targets. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Back on the local front, inflation prospects plunged to their lowest in a year this May, easing for the 3rd month in a row. According to the Bank of Korea, consumers expect an inflation rate of 3.5% over the next 12 months, down 0.2 percentage points on month. The central bank is linking the ease in inflation expectations to last month's drop in the consumer price index, which fell to the 3% range. Moreover, the composite consumer sentiment index was up some 3 points to 98, the highest in a year. Korea appears to be dominating the global TV market despite the current doldrums. According to market research firm Omdia on Tuesday, global shipments of TVs in the first quarter sank by more than 5% on year to just over 46 million TVs. Now, this is the lowest for the first quarter since the year 2009. Also, the value of these shipments shrank by nearly 13% to just under $22.5 billion. Despite the sluggish trade, Samsung Electronics ranked first in sales with a market share of over 32%, followed by LG Electronics in second place. Samsung Electronics accounted for more than 50% of the premium TV market in North America and Europe, while LG ranked first in OLED screens with a market share of nearly 60%. Over in Argentina, Korea's under-20 World Cup, that is World Cup team, marked its debut on the field with a 2-1 victory over France. Led by coach Kim In-jung, team captain Lee Seung-won scored first and then offered an assist to forward Lee Young-jun, who also found the net. France later responded with a penalty goal. The South Korean team now shares the top standing in Group F with Gambia, who beat Honduras. Korea plays Honduras on Friday at 6 a.m. Korea time.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now.
Hello.
We begin in the tech sector as Facebook parent company Meta has been handed a record fine of up to $1.3 billion by the European Union for violating data privacy rules. Announced by Ireland's Data Protection Commission on Monday local time, the fine comes after it was found that Meta continued to transfer data from its EU users to its US-based servers. This despite a court ruling in 2020 that invalidated a previous EU-US data transfer pact. The fine includes an order that Meta's Facebook platform stops sending EU users data to the US within the next 5 months. The fine tops the previous record EU privacy fine of over $800 million handed to Amazon in 2021. Meta says the fine is unjustified and unnecessary, and that it sets a dangerous precedent. Switching our focus to space now, as Saudi Arabia's first female astronaut has just boarded the International Space Station. Rihanna Barnawi, a breast cancer researcher and the first Arab woman to go to space, was welcomed aboard the space station by 7 other astronauts already stationed there. Also on her flight to the ISS were fellow Saudi Ali Arkhani, former NASA astronaut Peggy Whitson, and Tennessee businessman John Schaffner. They took a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket from Cape Canaveral as part of a private mission organized by Axiom Space. During their time on the ISS, both Banawi and Al-Khani will run over a dozen experiments, including research into cancer and how to generate artificial rain on potential sediments on the Moon and Mars. And finally, Lego has unveiled a life-sized Ferrari made using its signature plastic pieces. The Ferrari Monza SP1 was built in the Czech Republic, with Ferrari designers lending a helping hand. Over 383,000 Lego bricks were used, and the model is now on permanent display at Legoland Billund in Denmark. It took 339 days to complete the model, which weighs over 1,000 kilos. The only non-Lego components used were Ferrari wheels and a steering wheel. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. Air quality in central regions has improved, but those in the south and Jeju are still exposed to unsafe levels of yellow dust air pollution, with a dust advisory still in place, although things should improve as the day goes on today. Now, those in southern provinces are having much warmer daytime highs, going up to 7 degrees higher than yesterday afternoon, and the rest of the central regions are as warm as yesterday. But due to atmospheric instability, rain clouds will be formed, dropping unexpected rain in inland areas, with 5 to 20 millimeters expected, along with thunder and lightning at times. But it should remain sunny most of the day with strong UV rays. Meanwhile, weather conditions in Gohung in Jeollanam-do province, where South Korea's first homegrown space rocket Nuri will take off tomorrow evening, is forecast to have promising weather on Wednesday. Now, hot and sunny weather continues through Thursday, so please take care. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
And those are the headlines at this hour. We have our panel session coming up right after this break, so do stay with us.
Busan, Korea is already reaching the entire world. Like ocean waves that travel far and wide. It's Busan, the perfect World Expo city. Transforming our world, navigating toward a better future. World Expo 2030, Busan, Korea.
Contour the world, simply contour. India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. Are you excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music, start.
K-animation, loved and watched around the world. We want to make more animations to reach more children. Traveling time and space. Developing adventure and curiosity. Infinite creativity and hope. We want our children to grow up to be happy. K-animation, watched by children all around the world. So that joy can be felt when our animation is watched. This is the reason we make animation and share with the world. K-animation, befriending children all over the world.
A South Korean team of officials is currently in neighboring Japan for an on-site survey of Tokyo's plans to discharge radioactive wastewater from its crippled Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean starting this summer. So what is the Korean team's agenda in Japan? Do these independent surveys look to ease mounting concerns? And are there any alternatives to better tackling the Fukushima radioactive wastewater? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. In this edition, we touch upon efforts by a South Korean delegation over in Fukushima today to inspect its radioactive wastewater. For more on this, I have Dr. Tilman Riff, founding chair of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, live on the line. Dr. Riff, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Many thanks for having me, Sunny.
I also have Kwon-so here in the studio, so welcome back.
Hello, Sunny.
Right, so let's begin with a few details then about Japan's planned discharge of its Fukushima radioactive wastewater.
More than 1 million tons of wastewater from the devastated Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant are planned to be released into the Pacific Ocean. And Japan has been predicting this should start happening in spring or summer this year. Now, just a week left of May, so it's more likely to begin in summer if everything goes as Tokyo plans. Tokyo Electric Power Company, which is responsible for dealing with the crippled plant, says the process of releasing what it calls treated water is necessary for the decommissioning process and has gotten the approval from the Japanese government. Before getting into the reason for Japan's plan, let me take you briefly back to the 2011 disaster. March 11, 2011 was the day Japan was hit by a massive nuclear accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant following a devastating earthquake and tsunami. The plant's cooling systems were destroyed, leading to 3 reactors to melt and leak large amounts of radioactive materials. Ever since then, Japan has been struggling to handle the contaminated water for 12 years. The more than 1,000 tanks storing treated and diluted water or wastewater, TEPCO says, are 97% full. And it's a combination of groundwater, rainwater, and seawater that has accumulated with the cooling water over the years. So the tanks are full. Japan wants to prevent the risk of another leak in case of a natural disaster like an earthquake or tsunami again. Also, they need the space for an even tougher task ahead regarding melted debris. So how is the discharge going to work? Japan plans to release the water via an undersea tunnel after radioactive materials are removed through the Advanced Liquid Processing System, or ALPS. The discharge is estimated to take some 4 decades.
Right, I see. This past Sunday saw Korea dispatch its own delegation with inspectors to better assess Japan's upcoming release. Could you tell us a bit about the team and its mission there?
Right. I just laid out Japan's plan of its water release, but I didn't mention the safety concerns, which are immense, though, especially among countries that share the waters and that could potentially be affected by the dumping of the wastewater from Japan. Now, despite the Japanese government's continuous statements assuring the safety of the process, claiming the release meets international standards and won't cause any harm to the environment, for Korea, this, as well as the inspections of the International Atomic Energy Agency, was not enough to assure the safety of the nation's people in the coming years, especially in terms of the consumption of seafood. One concern that's been mentioned frequently is the concentration of tritium, a radioactive form of hydrogen that cannot be removed from the wastewater before being let go into the ocean. Now, Japan therefore gave the green light to a South Korean inspection team to visit the Fukushima nuclear power plant to examine the processes being made. And this agreement came during the recent South Korea-Japan summit between President Yoon and his counterpart Fumio Kishida. So a 21-member team arrived in Japan on Sunday for a 6-day trip. Now, yesterday on Monday, they kicked off official activities. It was mostly a meeting with officials from TEPCO, Japanese government officials, and the country's top nuclear regulator, the Nuclear Regulation Authority, for a briefing on details of the water discharge plan. And the actual on-site inspections are taking place today, Tuesday, and tomorrow. And on Thursday, in-depth discussions are scheduled based on the South Korean delegation's inspections. The gist during the review will be the examination of ALPS, the purification system I mentioned before. Now, Yoo Ki, Nuclear Safety and Security Commission chairperson who leads South Korea's delegation, told reporters on Monday that his team will check the system to assess the safety of the treated water and also check the K4 tanks, which store and measure radioactive substances with their own eyes, and that they will also request necessary data from Japanese authorities. Now, along with you, the team, meanwhile, is comprised of 19 experts from the Korea Institute of Nuclear Safety and one from the Korea Institute of Oceans Science and Technology. Japan had refused the visit of South Korean private experts, saying that this inspection is a government-to-government matter.
Right, and staying with that, Dr. Roof, the Korean delegation, as I mentioned, does not include civilian experts, and nor will it be able to collect samples of the wastewater. How do you respond?
My concern about this delegation, as with previous delegations that have visited from Taiwan, from the Pacific Island Forum, is that essentially the way that the Japanese government and TEPCO are portraying these visits are different from a comprehensive scientific independent evaluation. They really seem largely intended to reassure, provide limited access, limited public information, and limited findings on how well the purification system that they have established for the wastewater works. That's not something that one can measure as a one-off occasion at any particular time. That requires comprehensive results over a long period of time as to how the system is working. And so far, the level of transparency and timeliness of the results that have been made available have been, to be frank, concerningly limited. And so I'm really worried about the level of access and really whether this will really be able to conduct a thorough investigation to establish the safety of the process that's planned.
Right, and before we go any further, Dr. Roof just mentioned the team from Taiwan and the Pacific Island Forum. Could you tell us a bit more about those two earlier efforts to assess Japan's planned discharge?
Sure, Sunny. South Korea is not the only country in the region that has expressed concerns ever since Japan's announcement to release the wastewater this year. So the actual announcement came in April 2021, but earlier this year was when Japan actually provided that rough timeline of either spring or summer. Taiwan, for instance, had a 8-member inspection team sent in March last year, and this visit was accepted mainly due to Taiwan not being a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And later, there was another trip done in November by Taiwan, but this was more related to the lifting of seafood import bans the month before. So a checkup trip related to that. So you might be asking yourself, why did Taiwan just, lift import restrictions regarding seafood, while earlier they went to inspect the site because of concerns of the wastewater release. So this is actually a kind of political matter because Taiwan is looking for a membership at the CPTPP, which is a multilateral trade pact. So the gist is, I just want to mention that the second trip does not really have much to do with the first trip, I believe, although it is said that Taiwan has made a number of trips, inspection trips to Japan. But also I want to mention the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, which also had experts make a visit in February earlier this year, that being the PIF in short, which is an intergovernmental organization that's meant to enhance cooperation between countries and territories of Oceania. So both the Taiwan and PIF team were briefed by TEPCO and government authorities in Japan, and they inspected the K4 tanks, the ALPS system, and undersea tunnel. So not that much different from what the South Korean delegation is doing right now in Japan. So doubts also remained after the trip of Taiwan and the PIF, and that's why the PIF has also recommended Korea to request samples of the water treated by the ALP system, which, however, as we know, won't be the case. Meanwhile, an inaugural South Korea Pacific Islands Summit is slated to be held next week, where Japan's planned wastewater release is expected to be on the agenda. So many countries in the region are probably going to also ask South Korea about their recent trip.
Right, and staying with that, Dr. Ray, following its mission, the Pacific Island Forum reportedly proposed several alternatives to Japan, including the possible use of the wastewater to make concrete. Is this a viable option?
Yes, I think it is. And I think the process that the Pacific Islands Forum has engaged in this process is really commendable. They engaged a 5-person team of independent international experts from the United States, including some very respected marine scientists, nuclear physicists, people with different expertise from Australia, from Hawaii. And they met repeatedly with the Japanese government and TEPCO, as you mentioned, as well as with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and produced, to my knowledge, the only accessible independent report. And they were really scathing about the lack of adequate data to reassure this current plan that it was reasonable to proceed. And they were also rather scathing about the lack that they feel had been given to really viable alternatives that also expert groups in Japan have put forward. Radioactive elements decay over time. If the water was stored rather longer, instead of in these hastily built tanks cobbled together really under great duress at short notice, not designed for long-term storage, but the kind of tanks that are used, for example, for Japan's National Petroleum Reserve, seismically safe tanks built for the long term. If the water was stored for several decades and then released, then the radioactivity would be much less. The radioactivity would also be much less if, as the Pacific Island Scientific Panel recommended, that treated water were then used to make concrete for structural applications, for road foundations, for building foundations, for bridges and so forth, where the contact with humans and also other plants and animals would be very limited. And the beta radiation, which is one of the concerning forms of radiation that's emitted by those substances, would be contained within the concrete. A number of other alternatives have been proposed using bioremediation, using organisms like algae and various crustaceans that concentrate particular isotopes, and reducing the water volume through evaporation or some combination of those. As I understand it, and certainly as the Pacific Scientific Panel has recommended, none of these other alternatives have really been seriously explored. They would essentially avoid the transboundary and transgenerational hazards of simply releasing large volumes of radioactive material into the environment, where it will travel with ocean currents, it will concentrate in the food chain, it will be deposited in sediments, and really cause widespread and long-term radioactive pollution.
Right. Dr. Reeve, what potential information do you think shared by Japan could serve to perhaps allay regional safety concerns then?
Well, I think if Japan had really fully and comprehensively and transparently considered the alternatives, the risks and the benefits of the multiple possible approaches, and really laid out an open evidence-based process for making that decision, with ample evidence about what exactly is to be released. We don't actually know how much radioactivity will be released, and we don't know yet how well the purification system, this ALP system, works. On the basis of what's available now publicly, there has been very limited sampling with many periods of time up to a year where no results have been provided, for example, to the Pacific Islands Forum team. So we simply don't know what is there, and the evidence that is available is that the system hasn't worked as intended. TEPCO and the IAEA have said, well, then the water will simply be put through the system repeatedly. But before one embarks on such a major enterprise with consequences for all of the countries that border the Pacific and are located within it, the effectiveness of the system and exactly how it will work really needs to be established transparently for all to see well before the process is embarked on, not just prior to discharge when any preventive approaches or corrective approaches are essentially then impossible. It's too late. Right, I see. Meanwhile, against that backdrop, so here on the local front, the ruling People Power Party recently invited a physics scholar to share his thoughts with regard to Japan's plans. Could you tell us a bit about his stance?
If I had the chance, I would drink 10 liters of Fukushima water. That's the controversial statement made by Professor Emeritus of Oxford University, Prof Allison, who was invited for a lecture at a task force meeting by the ruling People Power Party at the National Assembly recently. That's the Protection of Our Sea Verification Task Force. And the professor there claimed that the safety concerns regarding the Fukushima plant are exaggerated. So here are some more of his quotes. "There is no difference between Fukushima seafood and Korean products. This water needs to be discharged sooner. Tritium is not a problem for the human body at all." He furthermore explained that he can't think of a particular effect from wastewater that could do more harm than when getting a CT scan or medical X-ray scan. So with these statements having been made just ahead of the Korean inspection team's dispatch to Japan, there were some fierce debates growing among politicians, with the main opposition Democratic Party calling on the canceling of the on-site inspection, with concerns the Yoon administration is trying to jointly defend or justify the Japanese government with its water release.
Right, and Dr. Roof, simply speaking, what are your thoughts on the wisdom of drinking, quote, treated radioactive wastewater from the crippled Fukushima nuclear power plant? Well, with all due respect, I don't know Professor Allison. I understand that his expertise is in physics, not in health. But a number of the views that he espoused then are really not in line with the evidence or with recommendations of respected national and international authorities that deal with radiation protection. And it would be unwise for anybody, as the professor mentioned, to be exposed to additional avoidable radiation, however it comes, whether for medical purposes or from environmental contamination or in any other way. Every increment of radiation that one might be exposed to does cause biological harm, and there's no level below which one can say there is no effect. So exposures of all types, medical or otherwise, should be minimised as much as possible. Certainly knowingly drinking radioactively contaminated material is unwise. Right, and Dr. Roof, the technical term, the jargon, tritium, has been thrown around quite a bit amid concerns of the Fukushima radioactive wastewater. What is it, and is it harmful? Yes, it is. It's one of the many hundreds of radioactive substances that behave in different ways, that are radioactive for different periods of time, that are produced inside a nuclear reactor or a nuclear bomb. It's one of those. It's a slightly heavier form of hydrogen, which is one of the most common elements, the lightest element. And it is the largest discharge of any radioactive substance from routinely operating nuclear plants. An excellent review on tritium's biological effects, researching all of the known literature, was just published last month. And that evidence shows very clearly that in all biological systems that were studied, plants, animals, bacteria, various larval forms of fish and a wide variety of organisms, tritium has biological effects that are about at least twice as harmful for the same amount of energy delivered as is caused by X-rays. So tritium is certainly a biological hazard. Because it has a half-life of 12 years, so that means every 12 years it decays by half, which is intermediate in radioactive terms, because it emits radiation that doesn't travel very far and isn't very highly penetrating. And because it is widely released by normally operating nuclear facilities, it's often considered relatively benign. But that radiation, which is not very penetrating, it won't penetrate your skin if it's outside your body. But the problem is when it's ingested, when it's taken in with food or water or inhaled, and comes in very close proximity to cells within the body. Then its hazard is, as I mentioned, at least double that of normal X-rays or gamma rays. Every radioactive substance that releases radioactivity that people are exposed to causes a long-term increased risk of cancer and various other chronic diseases for the life of that exposed person, and tritium is no different.
And Dr. Roof, one final question with regard to tritium. Very briefly speaking, what do scientists mean when they claim it may be more harmful to consume tritium through the food chain than through water?
Yes, this is a very important factor. I'm glad you brought that up, Sunhee, in relation to environmental discharges of radioactive materials, because many of them concentrate in particular areas like sediments in the sea, and they also accumulate within organisms. And so they concentrate up the food chain, so that the concentration in particularly large fish that are prized for eating, like tuna, at the top of the food chain, maybe tens or hundreds or in some cases even thousands of times higher than the levels of the plankton at the bottom of the food chain or the water that those fish are swimming in. So if people then eat that seafood, then they will be exposed to much more radioactive material than if they were just simply exposed to the water that those fish were in. The second particular reason why eating tritium in organic material, food and liquid, is biologically significant, apart from that you will get a larger dose if it's concentrated up the food chain, is that organically bound tritium, because chemically it acts essentially just like water, it becomes incorporated in water, but that hydrogen may also become incorporated into proteins and DNA and other important molecules in biological organisms. And so once it's organically bound, that tritium has a much longer residence time in our body and is much more likely to cause localized irradiation to cells that it gets inside. So for those two reasons, ingestion of tritium in foodstuffs is more significant a source of exposure than being exposed to it in the external environment or drinking it in water.
And hence the concerns with regard to Japan's planned discharge of radioactive wastewater into the Pacific Ocean, probably starting this summer then. All right, Professor Roof, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
My thanks for having me.
And so, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. We return same time tomorrow, that is Wednesday, so do join us then.